So let's move on to editing and testing of workflows. First, we need to know who can edit workflow and under what circumstances. Let's look at the first one. Jira administrators have full access to everything that is workflow related. They can create new workflows, edit all the elements of a workflow, including conditions, validators, post functions, triggers, transition screens, and properties. They can create and edit workflow schemes and associate workflow schemes with projects. They can also create and delete statuses. Project administrators have limited workflow editing capabilities, and only when the extended project administration permission is granted in the project's permission scheme. First, let's see how the setting appears. Extended project administration appears under the Administer Projects permission in the project's permission scheme. It is enabled by default, but Jira administrators can disable it via the checkbox. The setting allows project administrators limited editing of project workflows and screens. So assuming that this permission is granted, let's see what they can actually do. Here is a good summary. When extended project administration is granted, then project administrators can edit the workflow associated with their project, if it's unshared, create, update, delete transitions, add existing statuses to their workflow, delete statuses that aren't used by their project's issues. But they can't edit shared workflows or the Jira default system workflow, select or update a transition screen, edit transition properties, conditions, validators, or post functions, create new statuses, and they also cannot create, change, delete, or associate workflow schemes with projects. Finally, in Jira software, board administrators who are also project administrators can affect workflows by adding statuses to Agile boards which use the simplified workflow. When they add a status to the board, they are in effect adding it to the underlying workflow. Let's look closer. Remember that boards are tied to the underlying workflow. The top shows the sprint board and the bottom shows the workflow. No matter which workflow is being used by the board, board administrators can add, remove, or rename columns and change the status mapping. In this case, the board administrator could add a new column called QA, for example, and map the existing resolve status to it, so that each column only displays one status. The board administrator does not have to be a project administrator to do this. But let's say that the team wants to add a new status which doesn't currently exist in the workflow, like the testing status. Board administrators who are also project administrators can add statuses to a board if the board is using the simplified workflow. They would add the status and map it to a column accordingly. Adding a status to the board automatically adds the status to the underlying workflow and to the Jira instance itself if it doesn't already exist. So be watchful of users creating a lot of statuses. Again, adding a status to a board is only possible if the board uses the simplified workflow, and the workflow cannot be shared. And once again, the board administrator must also be a project administrator. Here's a summary of who can edit workflows and under what circumstances. It is possible to switch the workflow of a board to the simplified workflow if there is only one project being viewed by the board. That project uses a Jira workflow scheme which only has one workflow for all issue types. The workflow only uses post functions, validators, and conditions that are provided by Atlassian and not by apps. And that the existing workflow has at least one outgoing transition for each status. Now let's look at building new workflows. It is easier to copy and customize an existing workflow rather than creating one from scratch. Aim to use a small set of standard workflows. For example, there's no need to have 12 software development workflows when most of your dev teams follow the same process. Start simple and add on statuses and properties, etc., only when the requirements warrant it. An active workflow is a workflow that is currently being used by one or more projects in an active workflow scheme. When you edit an active workflow, Jira first creates a draft that you modify. When you've finished, you can publish your draft and, optionally, save your original workflow as an inactive backup. To edit workflows, you can use either diagram mode or text mode. Diagram mode is easier to understand and work with, especially for beginners. Text mode is a bit more advanced and shows the difference between steps and statuses. Either way you choose, you should finalize the diagram for end users so it appears intuitive when they click on the View Workflow link on an issue. An inactive workflow is one that is not currently being used by any projects. It must first be activated. Because there are no issues currently transitioning through an inactive workflow, you can easily modify steps and statuses. Inactive workflows need to be activated to use them in Jira. Activating is the process of mapping the workflow to a workflow scheme, and then associating the workflow scheme with a project. Issues will then need to be migrated, as we will see shortly. This is done by Jira administrators. There are some limitations to editing active workflows. You can only edit the description and not the name of an active workflow. Workflow steps cannot be deleted in an active workflow. The associated status of a step cannot be edited and the step ID cannot be changed. And if a step has no outgoing transitions, global transitions are not considered, it cannot have any new outgoing transitions added. Let's look at working with statuses. Statuses are global objects. Changing the name of a status on one workflow also changes it in all other workflows that use that status. Check before removing a status from a workflow that it's not being used in other places, like filters and dashboards. Removing a status from a copy of an active workflow will cause issue migration when the modified workflow is associated with a project. At that time, Jira will check if there are issues in the status that was removed. That means migrating issues. This diagram portrays migrating issues being mapped from statuses in the old workflow to statuses in the new workflow. The Jira administrator is prompted to select which status in the new workflow issues should be mapped to, and to select this for each issue type that will use the new workflow in the project. If there are a lot of issues to migrate, in the thousands, it could take some time. Before migrating, it's a good idea to run the database integrity checker and backups. It's always best to build and test workflows robustly on a test Jira environment, development or staging, instead of working in a live Jira instance. Alternatively, you can use a test project to test your workflows first in a production instance before implementing the change in an active project. If you do this, you may need to create test users and put them into project roles. Also ensure that permission scheme is appropriately set and that notifications are disabled. Always use caution when editing and publishing the draft of an active workflow to make sure you understand the implications, especially if it's shared. And save a backup copy when publishing in production, so you can refer back to it later if needed. If you are using a staging Jira instance, you can import and export your workflow between instances as either XML or workflow format. You can also share on the Atlassian Marketplace. But note that not all workflow functionality will be exported/imported, depending on the format and use of apps. Importing XML workflows is supported for server only. Finally, test everything thoroughly. Step through each status and transitions, checking if all conditions, validators, transition screens, and post functions behave as expected. Check triggers and their connected development tools, and see if the right event was fired and the right notifications were sent. You may need to use virtual users to test different permissions and memberships in groups and project roles.